Not the floor, the threshold seal. A two-part industrial epoxy compound rated for vehicular traffic and weather exposure, applied with a brush in a continuous bead along the workshop door's exterior threshold, filling the 3/4-inch gap between the door base and the concrete slab with a material that would, when fully cured at 72 hours, be functionally indistinguishable from the slab itself. The door was still closed, the Maybach was still inside. I had finished the floor epoxy the previous evening, a two-coat application of commercial-grade epoxy floor coating that I had been planning to apply to the workshop floor for 8 months and had scheduled for this weekend because the weather forecast showed the specific combination of temperature and humidity that epoxy application requires. And because my flight to Lisbon departed Sunday at 9:45 and I had a hotel reservation and a 10-day anniversary trip that my wife Miriam and I had been planning for 6 months, and that I was absolutely not cancelling because Karen Whitmore Slade had driven a $300,000 German automobile into my workshop. The threshold seal was the final step in the floor coating process. You apply the floor coating, you let it cure, and then you seal the threshold to prevent moisture infiltration under the door, which is the primary failure point for epoxy floor systems in exterior adjacent spaces. I had read 3 technical documents about this during the 8 months of planning. The threshold seal was not optional. The threshold seal was the correct final step. The threshold seal also meant that the workshop door, which operated on a standard overhead mechanism, could not be opened from either side until the seal was fully cured. At 72 hours from application, the seal would be cured. I would be in Lisbon. Karen would have had, for 72 hours, an opportunity to consider the specific consequences of driving a $300,000 automobile into someone else's locked workshop through a door she had manipulated open with a tool she should not have had access to at 4:17 on a Friday afternoon, while I was at a client meeting 40 minutes away, and Miriam was at her downtown office. I photographed the threshold application at 5:47. Then I photographed the door, closed, with the Maybach visible through the small window at the door's upper section. Then I photographed the curing schedule I had taped to the door exterior. The curing schedule said, floor epoxy application in progress, do not open door, full cure, 72 hours from application. I had taped it there at 6:15 Friday evening, after the Maybach was already inside, because the curing schedule was real, and the warning was real, and the fact that it also meant a $300,000 automobile was inside a sealed workshop for 72 hours was the natural consequence of the automobile having been driven into the workshop during an active floor coating project. I went inside, made coffee, packed my bag, took a car to the airport at 8 o'clock. Miriam was already at the gate when I arrived. She said, the threshold seal. I said, applied at 5:47, curing schedule posted. She said, the Maybach. I said, is inside the workshop. She said, with the floor epoxy. I said, yes. She said, and the threshold seal. I said, yes. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she uses when a situation has resolved in a way that is both entirely logical and specifically satisfying. She said, did you call Leonard? I said Thursday, before any of this happened, to document the prior incidents and establish the timeline. She said, so Leonard knew about the floor project. I said Leonard knew I was applying floor epoxy this weekend and that I had a flight Sunday morning. I told him Thursday. She said, before Karen drove into the workshop. I said 17 hours before. She said, Tobias. I said, yes. She said, you are a mechanical engineer. I said, yes. She said, and you documented the floor project with your attorney before it started. I said, it seemed prudent. She picked up her carry-on, let's board. What had sent Karen's Maybach into my workshop at 4:17 Friday afternoon was a sequence I had been documenting for 11 months. Not because I had known the Maybach was coming, but because I had known that the situation had a direction, and the direction required complete documentation before it arrived at its conclusion. The conclusion had arrived at 4:17 Friday. The documentation was complete. My name is Tobias Reeve, 50 years old, 22 years as a licensed mechanical engineer, the last 10 running my own engineering consultancy specializing in precision manufacturing systems and industrial process design. I design systems that require exact tolerances, complete documentation, and the specific discipline of someone who understands that the difference between a system that works and one that fails is usually the difference between what was documented and what was assumed. My wife Miriam is a licensed architect. She has spent 18 years designing buildings, understanding structure, space, material behavior, and the relationship between what is built and what lasts. She designed the workshop. The workshop was Miriam's professional work applied to our personal property, a 24 by 36-foot freestanding structure at the rear of our property in Crestwood Heights, a 44-home HOA outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The workshop housed my precision machining equipment, a CNC mill, a lathe measurement instrumentation, and the related infrastructure for the kind of precision work I did on consulting projects that required physical prototyping. It also housed Miriam's architectural model-making equipment and a portion of her project archive. The workshop was not a garage. It had a finished interior, climate control, precision flooring, until this week, painted concrete, and equipment that collectively represented approximately $400,000 of capital. It had a standard overhead door, 9 feet wide, because equipment deliveries occasionally required wide access. Karen Whitmore Slade had a 9-foot wide car. Karen lived 2 properties to the east of us. She was 58, former investment banker, current what she described as a private wealth consultant, which appeared to mean she managed investments for a small number of clients and maintained the lifestyle that 25 years of investment banking had made possible. The Maybach was a 57S, the long wheelbase model, hand-built, the one that started at approximately $280,000 and reached $300,000 with the options Karen had selected. She drove it to investment meetings and to the club and to her daughter's school events and to, apparently, my workshop. The situation had begun 11 months earlier when Karen had organized a neighborhood gathering at her house and had, over the course of the gathering, toured Miriam through her garage, a 3-car structure housing the Maybach, a Range Rover, and a vintage Porsche 911, and had mentioned that she found it frustrating that the Porsche had nowhere dry to sit during Charlotte's unpredictable spring weather. Miriam had mentioned, in the friendly conversational exchange of neighbors, that we had a workshop with a large overhead door and climate control, and that she was welcome to look at it if she was interested. Karen had looked at it. She had asked several questions about the door dimensions. She had admired the climate control system. She had said it was exactly the kind of space she had been hoping to find for the Porsche project she was planning. Miriam had said, politely and specifically, that the workshop was a working space and not storage. Karen had heard something different. The first incident had been 6 weeks later, a Saturday morning in April, when I had arrived at the workshop at 7:30 to find the overhead door slightly ajar and a faint scent of the specific leather conditioner that high-end German automobiles use coming from inside. The Porsche had been in my workshop. It was gone when I arrived, but the evidence of its overnight presence, a small oil drip, some tire transfer on the painted floor, the specific smell, was not. I had photographed all of it, then I had called Karen. She had said she had thought the arrangement was understood from Miriam's tour. I had said there was no arrangement and asked her not to use the workshop. She had apologized. She had said she would use a commercial storage facility. The second incident had been in May, the third in June. In both cases, I had arrived to find evidence of a vehicle having been present and subsequently removed, oil transfers, tire marks, once a forgot item. A Porsche-branded key fob holder that I had photographed and returned to Karen with a note. I had begun the documentation log after the second incident, because after the second incident it was clear this was not confusion. The log had 41 entries by November. In July, I had installed a keypad lock on the workshop door. The overhead door mechanism had a secondary lock that I had never had reason to use before, and I had replaced it with a commercial keypad unit. This should have ended the incidents. It had not, because in month 6, I had discovered that Karen had apparently obtained the keypad code through a method I could not directly establish. My best theory, which Miriam shared, was that she had seen me enter the code during the period when she was coming to the workshop frequently, and we had not yet understood the full scope of what was happening. I had changed the code. The incidents had stopped for 7 weeks. Then they had resumed, this time with the Maybach rather than the Porsche. The Maybach was harder to miss. $300,000 of hand-built German engineering occupied more of my workshop's visual field than the Porsche had. I had changed the code a second time in September. The Maybach had appeared in October after the second code change. She was getting the codes somehow. I had Leonard send a certified letter in October. The letter documented 7 incidents, stated that Karen's use of the workshop was unauthorized trespass under North Carolina General Statute 14.15913, noted the 2 code changes and the continued incidents, and requested immediate cessation. Karen had signed for the letter. The incidents had stopped for 6 weeks. The Maybach had appeared in December. The Maybach had appeared in January. The Maybach had appeared twice in February. After the second February appearance, I had called in a security consultant, a former law enforcement officer named Gerald, who had done security assessments for 3 of my commercial clients. Gerald had spent 4 hours at the workshop and had found, at the base of the keypad unit, a small electronic device attached to the conduit with industrial adhesive. The device was a commercially available keypad reader, the kind security researchers used to demonstrate keypad vulnerabilities, the kind that captured the electromagnetic signature of keys pressed and allowed the code to be recovered. Karen had placed a keypad reader on my workshop. She had been stealing my access codes. Gerald had removed the device, documented it, photographed it, and provided a written report. I had provided the report to Leonard. Leonard had filed a police report because placing a device to steal private security codes was not a civil matter, it was criminal. Deputy Marcus Osai had responded. He had reviewed Gerald's report, reviewed the device, reviewed my documentation log, and had said, with the specific tone of a law enforcement professional who has encountered a situation that is both clearly illegal and somewhat unusual, that he would be referring the matter to the DA's office. The DA's office had reviewed the referral and had opened a file. Between February and November, the situation had occupied the following positions simultaneously: an active DA file, a civil claim Leonard had prepared for unauthorized entry and trespass, and a documentation log with 41 entries. What it had not occupied was a resolution. Karen had retained Philip Morton, a Charlotte attorney who had the quality of a man who had reviewed a situation and was managing the exposure rather than contesting the underlying facts. Philip and Leonard had been in discussion for 3 months. The discussions had produced cordial professional correspondence and no resolution. Then, on a Friday in November, at 4:17 in the afternoon, Karen had driven the Maybach into my workshop. Not parked it outside, driven it inside. Through the overhead door that she had manipulated open using, I determined later, a universal remote that she had programmed to her Maybach's built-in HomeLink system during one of the prior access periods when she had been inside the workshop and had observed the door mechanism's frequency. She had programmed my workshop door's frequency into a $300,000 automobile. This was entry 42 in the documentation log. I had been at a client meeting in Concord when my workshop alarm had triggered. The alarm system I had installed in March, not a standard residential alarm, a commercial security system with interior motion sensors and door contact sensors, had logged the door opening at 4:17 and had sent a notification to my phone. I had looked at my phone in the middle of a client presentation and had seen workshop door OPNED, motion detected, camera alert. I had finished the client presentation. Then I had driven home. The Maybach was in my workshop. The interior camera had captured its arrival, the door opening, the car entering, the door closing. The Maybach's grille was approximately 4 feet from my CNC mill. The mill had cost $87,000. The distance between the Maybach's grille and my $87,000 mill was approximately 4 feet. I had stood in the doorway of the workshop for a moment and looked at this situation. Then I had gone inside the house and called Leonard. Leonard had said, "Where is the car now?" I said, "In my workshop, 4 feet from my CNC mill." He said, "Is Karen there?" I said, "No, the camera shows her entering and leaving on foot. She left the car." He said, "She drove it in and left it." I said, "Apparently she wanted secure, covered parking for the weekend." He said, "Her $300,000 car." I said, "Yes." He said, "In your workshop." I said, 4 feet from $87,000 of machining equipment. He said, "What are you planning?" I said, "I'm applying floor epoxy tomorrow. I've been planning it for 8 months. The weather conditions this weekend are optimal. I have a flight to Lisbon Sunday." He said, "You're applying floor epoxy with a $300,000 car in the workshop." I said, "The floor epoxy application requires the workshop to be sealed for 72 hours during cure. The curing schedule will be posted on the door. The threshold will be sealed as the final step in the process." There was a pause. He said, "The car will be inside for 72 hours. I said, "The curing schedule requires it." He said, "You're going to Lisbon." I said, 10-day anniversary trip, reservations made 6 months ago." He said, "The curing schedule and your trip are both documented." I said, "I called you today, Thursday, to document the ongoing situation and the weekend plans. That call is in your records." He said, "Before the car entered the workshop." I said, 17 hours before." He said, "Tobias." I said, "Yes." He said, "The floor epoxy." I said, "I've been planning it for 8 months. The weather this weekend is exactly right. The project cannot be postponed without rebooking the contractor and potentially missing the seasonal window." He said, "What contractor?" I said, "I'm doing it myself. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've done floor epoxy before. I have the materials." He said, "You planned a do-it-yourself floor epoxy project for this specific weekend?" I said, "I planned it 8 months ago. The materials have been in my garage since September." He said, "Is this true?" I said, "The materials purchase is on my credit card, September 14th. He said, "You bought floor epoxy in September." I said, "For a project I've been planning since March, when I installed the commercial security system and began taking the workshop security situation seriously." He said, "And the threshold seal?" I said, "Is the final step in any proper epoxy floor application. Every technical document on the subject recommends threshold sealing to prevent moisture infiltration." He said, "Every technical document?" I said, "I can send you 3. He said, "Please do." I sent him 3 technical documents on epoxy floor application. All 3 mentioned threshold sealing. 2 of them emphasized it. He called back at 9 that evening. He said, "The documents are legitimate." I said, "Yes." He said, "The curing schedule is real." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the car will be inside for 72 hours. I said, "While I'm in Lisbon, yes." He said, "Document everything as you go." I said, "I always do." I applied the first epoxy coat Friday evening after I had photographed the Maybach's position, photographed its proximity to my equipment, confirmed the alarm system, logs showing the door opening at 4:17, and confirmed the camera footage showing the car's arrival. I applied the second coat Saturday morning. I applied the threshold seal at 5:47. I photographed everything. I posted the curing schedule. I went to Lisbon. Karen called at 7:18 Saturday morning. I was at the airport. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail said that she needed her car for a meeting Saturday afternoon and asked that I open the workshop. I texted back, floor epoxy in progress, curing schedule posted on door, door cannot be opened for 72 hours, see you when I'm back from Lisbon. She called Philip Morton, Philip called Leonard. Leonard called me while I was in the boarding area. He said, Philip says his client needs the car. I said, the floor epoxy is curing. Opening the door would destroy the application and potentially compromise the workshop's structural seal. He said, he's asking whether you can make an exception. I said, the curing schedule is real, the project is real, the materials were purchased in September. The technical requirement for a sealed cure period is documented in 3 publications I sent you last night. He said, I know, I'm relaying the request. I said, the request is declined on technical grounds. The cure cannot be interrupted. He said, Philip says Karen is prepared to compensate you for the floor epoxy project costs if you'll open the door. I said, the project cost is not the issue. The technical requirement is the issue. The epoxy must cure. He said he's going to push back. I said, Leonard, Karen drove a $300,000 automobile into my workshop through a door she opened using a frequency she programmed into her car during a prior unauthorized entry. She has been accessing my workshop for 11 months using stolen access codes, a commercially available code-stealing device that she physically attached to my security system, and now the home link system of a luxury automobile. I have a DA file, 42 incident entries, and a civil claim in preparation. The floor epoxy is curing, and I am boarding a plane. He was quiet for a moment. I'll tell Philip the door will not be opened until the cure is complete. I said 72 hours from Friday evening application. That puts it at Monday evening. He said, you'll be in Lisbon until. I said, Sunday of next week. He said, the car will be inside for. I said, 8 days from the initial cure start, but the door can be opened after Monday evening if Karen arranges for someone to open it. She'll need the code. He said, she doesn't have the code. I said, no, she had a device that stole codes. The device has been removed. Gerald changed the code in February. He said, so the car is inside a workshop with an uncommunicated code until Monday evening when the seal cures, and Karen cannot open the door herself. I said, yes. He said, and you're boarding a plane. I said, final call, yes. I boarded. Miriam was in her seat already. She had been on an earlier connection from her project site in Raleigh. She handed me a coffee she had gotten from the lounge. She said, Philip called Leonard. I said, I know, the epoxy is curing. She said, he's going to escalate. I said, to what? The floor epoxy is a real project with real materials purchased in September and documented technical requirements. The threshold seal is the correct final step. I'm a mechanical engineer applying an epoxy floor system according to manufacturer specifications. She said, and the car is inside. I said, because Karen drove it inside. She said, that's an important distinction. I said, I've been careful about that distinction since Friday evening. She said, Leonard knows the distinction. I said, Leonard has the timeline, 42 prior incidents, the certified letter, the code-stealing device, the DA file, and a documented floor project planned 8 months ago with materials purchased in September. She said, it backfires completely. I said, the sequence is, Karen drove her car into my workshop without authorization. My floor epoxy project, which I had planned for 8 months and documented with my attorney 17 hours before the car arrived, requires a sealed cure period. The car is inside during the cure period. These are all facts. She said, and you're going to Lisbon. I said, I'm going to Lisbon. She said, for 10 days. I said, for 10 days. She sipped her coffee. The plane started moving. She said, the Maybach. I said, will be in my workshop until Monday evening when the cure is complete and Karen can arrange for the door to be opened. She said, she'll want you to come home. I said, I have non-refundable reservations. She said, she'll claim the car is being held hostage. I said, the car entered my property without authorization. The door cannot be opened during the cure period for technical reasons. These are separate facts. She said, Leonard will hold that line. I said, he has the technical documents. She said, and the September receipts. I said, and the September receipts. She settled into her seat. The plane lifted from Charlotte Douglas International and turned east over the Atlantic. She said, you've been planning this since September. I said, I've been planning the floor epoxy since March. I bought the materials in September when I found them on sale. She said, but you knew. I said, I knew the situation had a direction. I knew the direction required me to have documented plans that predated whatever Karen did next. She said, the floor epoxy was the plan. I said, the floor epoxy was a real project I genuinely needed to do. The timing worked out. She said, Tobias. I said, Miriam. She looked at me for a long time, then she said, happy anniversary. I said, happy anniversary. We flew to Lisbon. The HOA meeting was waiting when we returned. Harold Webb, our board president, had called it for the Thursday after our return. He had been receiving calls and emails from Philip Morton since Saturday and had reviewed the complete documentation, all 42 entries, the DA file reference, the criminal referral for the code stealing device, the certified letter, and the floor epoxy timeline. He had called me in Lisbon on Wednesday. He said, the floor epoxy. I said, has been curing. The cure was complete Monday evening as scheduled. He said, Karen retrieved the car Tuesday. I said, I gave Leonard the code Monday morning. He provided it to Philip. He said, she had to wait 3 days. I said, the epoxy required 72 hours minimum cure time before the door could be safely opened. I informed Karen of this via text Saturday morning. He said, she's claiming the car was being held hostage. I said, the car entered my property without authorization. The floor epoxy project is documented back to September with a purchase receipt and a call to my attorney 17 hours before the car arrived. He said, Leonard sent me the September receipt and the Thursday call record. I said, good. He said, the Thursday call is the key detail. I said, yes. I called Leonard to document the ongoing situation and the weekend plans 17 hours before Karen drove the Maybach into the workshop. The floor project was a documented prior plan. He said, and the 3 technical documents. I said, on threshold sealing requirements for epoxy floor systems. He said, I read them, they're convincing. I said, they're accurate. He said, the code stealing device. I said, is in Gerald's possession. His report is in the documentation file. The DA has the file. He said, the Maybach's home link system. I said, Karen programmed my door's frequency into her car during a prior unauthorized access period. My security system log shows the door opening at 4:17 on Friday using a HomeLink-compatible frequency rather than the keypad code. He said, so she had multiple methods of access. I said the stolen code system was removed in February. She then used the HomeLink system she had programmed earlier. Harold was quiet for a moment. How many methods of unauthorized access does one person need? I said, apparently more than two. He said, the board meeting Thursday. I want the complete documentation presented. I said, I'll be there. The meeting was attended by 41 of 44 households, the highest attendance in Crestwood Heights HOA's history, Harold told me before the meeting. I presented the documentation, the 11 months of incidents, the keypad code changes and the resumed incidents, Gerald's discovery of the code stealing device, the DA referral, the home link programming, the certified letter, and the floor epoxy timeline, the March decision, the September materials purchase, the Thursday call to Leonard, the Friday evening application, the Saturday threshold seal, and the curing schedule. I put the September receipt on the screen, the floor epoxy materials purchased September 14th. I put the Thursday call record on the screen, Leonard's case notes from the Thursday documentation call, time-stamped 17 hours before the car entered the workshop. I put the 3 technical documents on the screen, the sections on threshold sealing highlighted. The room was quiet during the technical documents section. In the specific way rooms are quiet when they are watching someone present information that is simultaneously ordinary and specifically well-timed. A man named Theodore Briggs, who had been in Crestwood Heights for 15 years and who had the quality of someone who had seen a great deal and found most of it unsurprising, said, "You bought the epoxy in September." I said, "September 14th. He said, "And called your attorney in November, the Thursday before." I said, 17 hours before the car arrived. Theodore said nothing else. His expression, which I will not attempt to characterize beyond noting that it was not unsympathetic, said what he chose not to say. Karen was not present. Philip Morton had sent an email saying she was indisposed. Philip was not present either. Karen's husband Richard attended. He sat in the back row with the expression of a man who has spent 11 months watching a situation develop and has arrived, finally, at the room where its full dimensions are being presented. Harold called the vote. Formal censure for 11 months of unauthorized access to private property, 5-0. Formal finding that the code-stealing device constituted criminal conduct independent of the HOA's authority to address, 5-0, with referral of support for the DA's file. Formal finding that the Maybach's presence in the workshop during the floor epoxy cure period was the consequence of Karen's unauthorized entry and not the result of any action by the property owners, 5-0. Formal statement of board support for the civil and criminal proceedings, 5-0. In the parking lot, Richard came to find me. He said, "September." I said, "September 14th. He said, "You bought the epoxy before she drove the Maybach in." I said, 8 weeks before. He said, "And you called Leonard the Thursday before." I said, 17 hours before. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "She spent the weekend without the car." I said, "The epoxy required 72 hours. He said, "She has a Range Rover." I said, "Yes." He said, "The meeting she said she needed the Maybach for." I said, "Yes." He said, "She drove the Range Rover." I said, "I assumed so." He looked at the community center. "I knew about the first few times she used your workshop. She told me you had a storage arrangement." I said, "We did not." He said, "I know that now." He paused. "I didn't ask questions I should have asked." I said, "Richard." He said, "I know." I said, "The civil matter and the DA file are proceeding. Philip and Leonard are in discussion. The documentation is complete." He said, "What does resolution look like?" I said, "Full restitution for the security system upgrades, Gerald's assessment, and our legal fees, removal of the home link programming from the Maybach, a formal written acknowledgement that the workshop was never available for Karen's use, and that the 11 months of access were unauthorized." He said, "She's going to resist the acknowledgement." I said, "The DA file makes the acknowledgement redundant, as a factual matter. He said, "I'll speak with Philip." He extended his hand, the handshake of a man who is ashamed and is not trying to minimize it. I shook it. Miriam was at the car. She had been speaking with Harold. She said, "Richard apologized." I said, "Yes." She said, "The workshop," I said, "is fully sealed." Gerald installed a new door mechanism with a rotating code system and a tamper alarm on the HomeLink frequency receiver. She said, "She can't get in." I said, "No." She said, "The resolution." I said, "Leonard and Philip are talking. The terms include the HomeLink removal." She said, "The Maybach's HomeLink has to be reprogrammed." I said, "Yes, the frequency has to be cleared from the car's memory." She said, "She programmed her $300,000 car to open your workshop." I said, "During a prior unauthorized access period." Yes. She said, "And the code-stealing device." I said, "Which she physically attached to my security system." She said, "For 11 months." I said, "Yes." She got in the car, then she said, "The epoxy looks good." I said, "Thank you, I thought the application went well." She said, "The threshold seal." I said, "Properly cured, the floor is fully sealed." She said, "Gerald said it's the best residential epoxy floor he's seen." I said, "Gerald knows floors." She said, "He said the threshold seal specifically was very professionally done." I said, "I researched the technique thoroughly." She said, 8 months of research." I said, "It's a complex application." She said, "And the Maybach was inside for the cure period." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because Karen drove it in." I said, "Yes." She said, "Happy anniversary." I said, "Happy anniversary." The civil resolution came 7 weeks later. Karen's homeowner's insurance carrier was involved. The code-stealing device and the HomeLink programming had created liability exposure that exceeded what the civil claim alone would have produced. The carrier's resolution team had reviewed the documentation and had reached their own conclusion about the merit of Karen's position. The resolution included full restitution for the security system, Gerald's assessment, and our legal fees. The Maybach's HomeLink was professionally reprogrammed by the Mercedes dealer with documentation, and Karen signed an acknowledgement, formal and notarized, that the workshop had never been available for her use, that the 11 months of access had been unauthorized, and that the code-stealing device and the HomeLink programming had been willful acts. The DA's file produced a separate outcome, a diversion program, a significant fine, and a period of supervised compliance. Karen and Richard listed their house in January. It sold in 38 days. The buyers were a couple in their 40s, a physician and a software architect, who came to introduce themselves on a Sunday afternoon with the pleasant directness of people who had found what they were looking for and were glad to be there. They did not ask about the workshop. They did not need to. I opened the documentation log for the last time. 42 entries, 11 months, a code-stealing device, a HomeLink frequency, a floor epoxy project planned 8 months earlier with materials purchased in September. I wrote the final entry. Resolution complete, civil settlement executed, DA diversion program completed, HomeLink reprogrammed with documentation, acknowledgement signed, floor fully cured, workshop secure, documentation closed. I closed the notebook. The workshop floor was exactly what the technical documents had said it would be when properly applied. Clean, sealed, durable. The threshold was sealed correctly. The door mechanism operated smoothly on its rotating code system. The Maybach had been inside for 72 hours. The floor had cured correctly. The workshop was mine. It had always been mine. The floor epoxy just made sure everyone knew what happens when you drive someone else's car into someone else's sealed workspace during a cure period that was documented 8 months in advance. Framed thumbnail text. She drove her $300K Maybach into my workshop. The epoxy was already planned.